Who was your pediatrician growing up?
A doctor in New York, who I think was on the east side, and his name was Dr. Howell.
What was he like?
I remember him being somewhat elderly to me. He was kind and gentle, and my mother really liked him. I remember that. And I remember something specifically that he, in those days, would test hearing by whispering in your ear very, very softly, and you would repeat the number or letter that he gave you. And I thought it was amazing how quietly he could talk.
What about mentors growing up?
I would include my father.
Sure.
Certainly, he was a bit of a somebody who gave lectures, not necessarily in a good way, but one of his pet themes certainly was this: how much he enjoyed his work and his helping people and being a professional, what he would emphasize as a professional.
Did he encourage you to go into medicine?
I think he did, quite actively, yes. I think he wished he had gone into medicine and wasn't able to at the time.
What about your mom? Did she play a role?
She was a teacher, so she worked with children. I guess in that way, maybe indirectly, that played some role.
Did you have siblings?
I had a sister, older sister. We were quite close, teased each other, but had a good time, yes.
What profession did she choose?
She is a psychotherapist. I went to medical school in University of California at San Diego, which was a great experience. It was only the second year that they were taking medical students. It was a very small class and very exciting in those days. So. And then I did my training, my residency training in pediatrics for 3 years in Philadelphia at a children's hospital called St. Christopher's. And also found that to be a very good training experience.
And what was your first job?
First job, I actually stayed at St. Christopher's for about 7 years and worked in the outpatient department, primarily taking care of patients and also teaching medical students and residents, doing some work on the inpatient side as well. And after 7 years there, I went into a group practice in the Philadelphia suburbs. Pediatrics is much more about health than disease, I think, and spend a tremendous amount of time counseling parents about preventive measures and keeping kids healthy and reassuring parents about the health of their children. So disease is, of course, a part of it, but I would say percent-wise you spend much more time dealing with health. As pediatricians are trained in such detail in terms of emotional health, but I think everybody who goes into the field has an interest, or certainly I did. I have a big interest in that area. And you're called upon to try to answer questions in that realm, to know when to refer people to get further help. It's I think, a very big part of pediatrics in any practice.
Did you develop an approach to pediatrics from did your medical school have any specific philosophy of pediatrics?
I would say not that I particularly identify. I think people bring their own approaches in a way. They learn the material, and then practice is just what it says. It's, you practice at it and you develop your own approach to how you balance the elements. So I think I always felt that one of my biggest jobs was to connect to patients and parents on a very direct level, and to make sure that I was answering their questions and providing reassurance when necessary, and making sure that there were no questions left in the room.
How do you encourage a parent to be confident in their parenting skills when they feel a little shaky about it or uncertain?
I think a lot of it has to do with normalizing what they may be describing, since much of what parents are concerned about, both in terms of physical growth or development, but also emotional issues, I think much of what parents are concerned about are really within normal range. So if it was my judgment that what they were talking about was reasonably normal, I would try to reassure them. And I think by listening and by reflecting, maybe partly from my own experiences and partly from what I had heard from other people, you kind of build up your own techniques for reassurance.
Did you have to develop a business acumen in running a practice or working with a group of doctors regarding the business side of things?
Yes, and that was kind of a natural process. I joined a practice that at that time had 4 other doctors, 3 of whom were very experienced already in pediatric practice and run a successful practice for a long time as one of the first group practices in that particular area, although many others developed subsequently. And so they knew quite a bit about how to manage a practice in the old days. And by which I mean that when I started, everything was, for a while, still prior to HMO insurance, prior to changes in healthcare. And that transition happened probably 7 to 10 years after I joined the practice. And at that point, those people had less experience with those new, nobody had experience with this new paradigm. And as those fellow doctors, fellow partners retired, I was sort of the third in succession of that group to then be the primary person running the practice. And I did that for probably 20 years, my last 20 years. Yes. So I was what we call the lead physician, the person making, with the ultimate responsibility, let's say, for the business part of it.
What advice would you have to doctors starting out in terms of the business? Like, give us some pointers that you learned to run a successful medical practice.
Well, of course, the biggest thing, I think, is to provide good service. So to be readily available, to give patients good information on the phone, to be available at night as much as possible, that the people in the practice themselves are available at night, to not rush people, to have good referral resources so you know where to send people, people who are trustworthy. I think a lot of course, the biggest part of business advice is just being a good practitioner. Beyond that, these days, many practices are part of big groups, much bigger business entities, and that was the case for us as well. We were first for about 7 years, and I'm not quite sure when this started, probably 1990, something like that. We joined the University of Pennsylvania, and we were part of their group of practices, and then they at some point stopped being involved with pediatric practices and we were cut loose, and we joined then another large group of practices. And my point in that is that in those situations, which are now the majority of practices, a lot of your business is run by that larger entity, and a lot of necessary business advice may be provided by that entity too. So if you have questions about personnel or salaries or hours or other kinds of what might be considered really business questions, you can ask, hopefully, good people in that organization.
Does that make life easier for doctors, or are there also bureaucratic issues with being affiliated with a larger group?
Sure, it's a complicated question. I mean, it was when I first joined and everything was simple and it was much less complicated with the industry of medicine. It seemed much more straightforward, but we had to do all of our own work, our own billing, or had to be in charge of all of this ourselves. And so there are definitely pluses and minuses of these big organizations. I think a lot of doctors now would say that it's gotten very complicated to work with all of the insurance business part of the insurance, and that it helps to have a large organization.
Do you have thoughts on the healthcare issue in the United States, Obamacare, universal healthcare? Do you have thoughts about that?
I have huge thoughts. I am very much in favor of universal healthcare. I think our system is still very complicated, even under Obamacare. I would much prefer to have a European system with one basically government-run healthcare system. I think it would be overall much better, much more efficient.
Within pediatrics, what were some of the trends that you sensed or had to deal with over the course of time?
Definitely the, let's say, narrowing of what many primary care pediatricians considered their jobs, in that we saw the development of first neonatology and specialists within nurseries taking care of sick newborns, which we used to do ourselves. Those same people went to high-risk deliveries, which we used to do ourselves. And then we saw the development of hospitalists in many hospitals. All the hospitals that we dealt with had hospitalists, so that, again, we used to take care of the kids in the hospital. We now, for the last half of my practice experience, referred kids to hospitalists, and they would do that care. Another trend was definitely the improvement in child health, especially because of introduction of more vaccinations so that people who practiced over my period of time saw huge changes with elimination of serious forms of meningitis from introduction of vaccines and other serious infections caused by bacteria, issues that used to certainly keep us awake at night. I feel like I really remember a marked change when, for example, the HIV shot or Haemophilus influenza shot, that's what it means, that's a certain bacteria, and that caused horrendous types of meningitis and skin infections and eye infections and throat infections, all of which were very aggressive. And so before that vaccine, we would get phone calls where those issues would be right at the front of our mind, that this child had one of these serious conditions that would develop very quickly. And after the introduction of the vaccine and after multiple years, we began to realize that we were not getting those calls anymore. Or if you got a call that had some of that flavor, you could say to yourself, well, it's not that disease, because it was almost 100% eliminated by the vaccine. The vaccine was so successful.
Is there a higher, in your estimation, a higher enjoyment of the work by pediatricians as opposed to other doctors because of the access to children and those personal relationships?
I think there may be. I have an intuition that pediatricians are relatively happy with their work. I don't know statistics, just a sense.
When you hear a child crying for the trillionth time, there must be some exasperation for the grind of pediatrics. How do you keep your sense of joy?
I think in the practice setting, you're pretty much immune to that cry. If it's your own child or grandchild, you're less insulated from it. So it's a different emotional situation, different emotional reaction.
Did you have the issue of getting emotionally involved with a patient who was having a difficult time and you having a tough time dealing with someone dying or in a difficult circumstance?
Oh, sure. I mean, if anything was quite serious with the patient, it was always something that I felt very involved with.
Did you encounter, I'm sure you did, the issue of childhood obesity, and how did you deal with it in your practice?
Yes, encountered it all the time, all too often, and I think dealt with it with great difficulty, to be honest. I think it's a very tough subject whenever it comes up, because I think, how can I put it? The parents make their best effort to try not to overfeed their kids, but I think some parents naturally do, and some kids naturally just overeat, and it's a very challenging problem for kids as well as adults. And I think I tried to deal with it by giving, the best advice that I could, and we had handouts, and we certainly sometimes referred to nutritionists for people who were interested, but it was still a difficult problem, and I think almost seemed that the people who had the most success with dealing with it just kind of turned off a switch inside them. They changed how they were approaching eating, and were able to solve their problems. But I'm not sure how much that we as professionals helped them, or that I helped them.
The role that your wife played in your medical practice, you want to tell us about that?
Well, it reminds me that another change we did talk about was the general schedule. I sort of implied it, that we used to do a lot more when I went into practice in terms of night, going into hospitals at night, taking care of inpatients. So I did, this is a way of saying at the beginning, first half of my practice, the hours were pretty challenging. I think we were in the office late, we worked Saturdays and Sundays, we went to the office, had office hours Saturdays and Sundays, even though it was a group, and that helped because I wasn't on every night. We took turns with that, but it was pretty tough schedule, and of course that meant that my wife was doing a lot of the childcare herself, and kind of giving me that support that I needed to do what my role was. We managed partly by our kids were really born literally when I had started into the practice itself, when I had left the hospital job, exactly when my first son was born. So kids were little when I was working the hardest. And one of the ways we managed was my wife would sometimes meet me for dinner, or there was a time that we had enough break in the afternoon that I would come home for dinner, and she'd often bring the kids somewhere near the office, and we would maybe have lunch together on the weekends, so that we tried to spend a little more time together that way.
Do you ever think about the road not traveled? Was there another profession that you considered early on?
I thought about architecture, so that gets back to that college course in architecture. I was interested in architecture. I was just had some attachment to that field, and I never pursued it in any detailed way.
Did you encourage your kids to go into medicine?
A little, but not a lot. I didn't sense that either one of them was particularly interested. One was clearly interested in science, but in a different way. And so I think it would have been fine with me if they did. By example, I hoped I was encouraging them, but it wasn't for them. One is an artist and found his voice that way, mm-hmm. and the other became a lawyer and loves it.
Can you tell us the most rewarding thing about being a pediatrician?
I really felt that knowing families over time, and especially, I think, troubled families over time, and getting them through some of these troubles, whether the troubles were, again, emotional or physical, or dealing with chronic disease, or unfortunately dealing with tragedies. But mainly the sense of knowing people over time with their trusting me and my trying my best to provide support. I think that's where the center of my sense of reward was.
What insights did you gain during your years of as a pediatrician about parenting?
I think, again, most of the answer to that question probably comes from my own sense of parenting more than what I learned, even in medical school, or, But I think just to balance the trying to listen to children, to really see them as individuals so that you hear their voice as they develop, to trying to, of course, provide safety for them and a steady, nurturing environment, balancing that with some reasonable sets of limits and expectations. And I think also balancing that with allowing them to gradually become more independent so that they can find their own way. And that's, I think all of those balances are pretty tough, but I think if anybody were to ask me how I would think about parenting, those would be the main aspects.
I have a few quotes. Samuel David Coleridge: "He is the best physician who is the most ingenious inspirer of hope."
Yes, I think not false hope, but reasonable hope. For sure, one of the biggest gifts you can give to somebody in your care, whether it's the child who's old enough to understand or the parent, is to provide reassurance and normalization and hope.
Each of us is so much more than one thing. A sick child is so much more than his or her illness. Fred Rogers.
Sure. It's always the whole person that you're looking at and treating.
People pay the doctor for his troubles. For his kindness, they still remain in his debt. Seneca.
I'm going to pass on that.